Welcome to Black Diamond Coaching Tutorials. Today we're going to be discussing progressions leading from the side cartwheel beam dismount, a level green to blue skill, to the side cartwheel turnout dismount, also known as the quarter turn dismount, which is a black or epic level skill. There are two prerequisites for this skill. Number one, a 2-second handstand from a cartwheel, which will be learned first on the floor and then on a floor beam. And number two, a side cartwheel dismount, which the athlete will learn from a floor beam dropping to a plank position on an 8-inch mat, and which they then perform from a spotted cartwheel handstand on a high beam. Just a quick note here about spotting these dismounts on beams. We always want to stand to the gymnast's back, meaning it's very important to know whether they're a left-handed cartwheeler or a right-hander, so we know where to position ourselves to save the fall toward the back. That's the dangerous one, in which we need to lower the athlete slowly to the ground over our shoulder, whereas the fall to the front is actually nothing more than the side cartwheel dismount, which is easy for them to land without a spot because they can see the landing and stick it simply by piking. It's a bad habit, as shown here, however, not to hold the handstand for at least 2 seconds first before dropping straight down, as well as to kick past the vertical handstand so that they end up landing at any other angle other than 90 degrees to the beam. Once they've mastered the side handstand dismount, we take them back to the floor beam, where they now kick up with the stomach rather than their back to the wall. For the first few reps, it's fine to use the wall to hold their balance with their toes, then use their toes to push out and fall down to a flat back on an 8-incher. After that, we want them to balance for 2 seconds without the wall, then intentionally shift their axis toward the back to initiate the flat back, and then gradually add a quarter pivot to land in a push-up plank. They might do several hundred of those side handstands to flat backs over several months before they're ready to start adding the quarter turn. It's very typical once we get to that point that the girls will be unsure of which hand to raise and which direction to pivot. And so this is exactly why we have them figure it out on a floor beam before ever attempting it on a high beam. So we can slow things down, help them get their bearings, show them which way their shoulders and torso pivot before adding any degree of danger and difficulty by increasing the height from the ground. The first thing that often goes wrong when we get to this quarter turn sequence is that when their attention goes too much to their hands, they forget what their torso and their feet should be doing. And the more we can, again, slow this down to help them feel which direction to twist and then slowly lower them down, the better they can stay tight and straight as they approach this landing. There's a simple rule we should memorize for which hand it is they raise. If they're a left-handed cartwheeler, they raise their right hand. If they're a right-handed cartwheeler, they raise their left hand. And another way to think of this is that they're going to stay on their dominant hand to pivot. Something that feels strange to them on the dominant hand, however, is that the fingers end up pointing in, as Emily is pointing out and complaining of slightly here. This is actually more pronounced on the floor beam version of this skill and sort of disappears when we get to the high beam, but it's something they need to get used to and accept so that they don't mistakenly feel that they're doing something wrong. And one technique we can use here if the girls get too spirited in their objection of this position is to have them go to the floor, kick up into a handstand, and then pirouette out of it. And they'll see that it's actually the same position they're accustomed to there on the floor that now feels a little more restricted on the beam. While we're speaking about the hands here, let's take a look at proper hand position for any of these side handstands on a beam. It's a detail that's easy to overlook, but it's important to make correct on every repetition. We don't want the hands on top of the beam, either perpendicular to it or along the length of the beam. It's a position that the gymnast will sometimes gravitate to in order to solve that pivoting problem that leaves their wrist feeling jammed up, but it makes it very difficult to hold the handstand in a solid position for the length of time they're going to ultimately need to perform these skills. So we want the fingers down the length of the beam with the knuckles wrapping around the edge of the beam. This is the proper hand position for all of these sequences. Let's make sure that our gymnasts are learning correctly from these tiny details that will deliver them to our team coaches with the best habits possible. At any rate, once they've worked through 100 or so of these repetitions of quarter turns on a floor beam with a 2-second hold preceding it, they can now start to take this skill to the high beam where it absolutely must be spotted. Again, from the back to save the blindsided fall. And with enough repetitions, they'll come to feel that just as the pirouette out of a failed handstand is a good exit strategy on the floor, it's the best way out of a tilted axis toward the backside on the beam. In this case, a tilted axis that's initiated deliberately from the side handstand toward the back in order to make this quarter turn dismount possible and perfect.